It is incredibly rare that I open a book and feel this absolutely stupid. Occasionally, yes, I'll open a book and I'll go, yeah, I'm a little in over my pay grade. This isn't exactly where I'm at, in a place to understand this, actually. First time reading this. I was like, yep, that one's going to go back on the shelf for a while. I'll come back to it in a few years. This book, however, I opened and I thought to myself, what in the world am I doing right now? Is he speaking English? Am I a toddler among intellectual giants? And I've just never realized that fact, because this is literally nonsense to me, and my brain hurts. So, today we are in fact discussing Harry Partch's Genesis of Music, 2nd edition. I have been reading this book since early May. I started writing this script, and this video was supposed to come out in September. Early September. It's now early October. Typically, I should like to state, this is not a brag, this is just I have a fast reading brain. I read and take notes, usually about a week, max, for a book. If it's something I don't understand, or a concept or technique that I'm not really used to, about a week to take notes, digest, kind of understand what's going on. I had to take very generous breaks with this book, like several days at a time, just to be like, what the fuck am I thinking? What am I doing? Why am I reading this? This took 9 pages of notes in my notebook before I gave up on taking notes, because I had no clue what was going on. And that's, most books take up a page, 2, 3. I got to chapter 7 before I stopped taking really substantial notes. First off, let's discuss Harry Partch. He's the guy who wrote it. He's kind of a maverick in every sense of the word. He's this guy who just eschews traditional everything. Spent most of his life in the American Southwest, born in Oakland, California. Exposed to a wide variety of cultures and influences. He tells a lot of this story in the book, actually. Before he enrolled at the University of Southern California, studying composition. Partch was not enthused, shall we say, by the classical music education he was receiving there, and subsequently left, basically just swearing off of what we might consider the Western classical music canon, and just began, exploring different things. After an interaction with, I believe, the work of Hermann von Helmholtz on the sensations of tone, Partch began looking into just intonation, a form of music, based off of acoustically pure intervals. Then, for the rest of his life, Partch would go on to kind of pioneer his own theory of music, his own scale, and his own kind of system of music, alongside being a prolific writer and creator of instruments. Now, this book is not small. This is not a small book by any means. So we had 2 prefaces, one to the 1st edition, one to the 2nd edition, 18 chapters, and then 6 appendices, along with works cited, additional works cited, and an index. Not to mention a few pages of pictures. The chapters are split into 4 separate parts, and the book totals out at 517 pages. So let's get into it, shall we? The book actually begins with the preface to the 2nd edition, which explains some differences between, the 2nd edition and the 1st edition of this, seeing as it had been over 25 years between the publication of the 2. There are new chapters, 12 and 13, an added chapter 14, and then some of the appendices add on more explanations of the music, some performances of the time, and just a whole bunch of additional information. The original preface, unchanged from the 1st edition, and from the first set of words, you can really get Partch's disdain for the institution of Western music, both from educational and performance angles. He quite literally calls it a tyranny. So, Part 1, Corporeal versus Abstract Music, begins with Chapter 1, titled From Emperor Chun to the Vacant Lot. If I'm butchering that, I apologize. And here Partch gives us this kind of almost autobiographical justification for his system of music, bringing us to an explanation of what the header of this part really means. He has an interesting statement here on page 7 that I want to highlight, where he's discussing how America, as a whole, has a wide range of responses that you'll find in music. As he says, Somewhere along the American line, a composer, whatever opposition and indifference he meets, will find mountain people to like him if he writes mountain music, valley people to like him if he writes ballad music, Sinophiles to like him if he writes Chinese music, and someone to understand him if he goes off the deep end to write something that no one understands. A truer statement I doubt I could ever find on music in America. He also begins something of a historical justification of his theory of music, which he calls the monophonic concept. It relies first on this distinction between abstract music and corporeal music, which he defines. Corporeal music can be listed as the essentially vocal and verbal music of the individual, since it is a music that is vital to a time and place, a here and now. In my notes, I have corporeal music kind of defined as, vocalized words intend to display meaning. And I try to highlight how the individual and emotional, tactility of the music are paramount. On the other hand, abstract music, as he defines it, is discussed as a mass expression in its highest application, the spirits of all united into one and transported into a realm of unreality, neither here nor now, but transcending both. Mouthful. My notes kind of list this as being musicalized, ritualized, or rendered words, or all purely instrumental music. Partch calls this music, always instrumental, even when it involves the singing of words, because the emotion of an individual conveyed through the vitally rendered words would instantly end the characteristic domination of nonverbal form. In essence, it kind of boils down to storytelling and emphasis of the individual, it being the defining matter between the two. Right. After these definitions, Partch goes on to discuss Greek drama, which he cites kind of basically as the ideal version or basis for the monophonic concept. It was a little cloudy. It was not the most clear to me. And I did write the script a long time after reading that part. And then he talks about Asian dramas for a while. Then Christian hymnology, or the singing of hymns in Christian churches, which he uses to make a lot of big claims about how the Catholic Church ruined music. Or at least, the monophonic Greek concept, or, corporeal music. He really does not like the Catholic Church. I have to get this across to you. Not a fan of the Catholic Church. I have to get this across to you because it came across to me very strongly. Granted, I'm a Catholic, so maybe that was just a bias point on my part. Who knows? His big point about this is summed up on page 19, in my opinion, where he complains about melismatic music, saying, a word has 4 properties. 1, a rhythm, that is, its natural pattern of dynamics and a reasonable length of time for speaking to cover. 2, phonics. 3, an intrinsic meaning. And 4, drama, the obligation to follow its fellow words to hold the interest. Our realistically minded man might have drawn 4 conclusions. That to the extent that a vowel of a syllable is inordinately sustained, its rhythm is damaged, its phonics is distorted, its meaning is dissipated, and its drama is demoralized. Essentially, he seems to think that, music should convey the same kind of concept of words as I'm giving you right now. Where I'm speaking, my words are following a distinct rhythm, the phonics are being properly observed, and the drama of each word, the natural lead in the sentence, is being properly conveyed in his opinion, and music has to align with that. And any music that does not do that, abstract music. And with only abstract music and no outlet for the corporeal music, the church was essentially cutting people off from true self-expression, and that's why minstrels and troubadours sprouted up in reaction to the church being the only accepted music. Question that a little bit, because yes, while troubadours and minstrels were highly syllabic music, it's very much one syllable to one beat, they also did have melismatic moments. And it's not unusual for someone to, extend a word. To purposely elongate a word for drama or effect. Something slowly said, kind of like that, where I'm elongating a word, giving myself time to think, or drawing attention to it, yada yada. Then comes a very lengthy discussion of opera, starting with early opera forerunners in Florentine, then Paris, and around here's where I have this question, and I wrote it in the margins of the book. I wonder what Partch would think of modern musicals. Interesting thought to me, because they do include a number of, more speaking elements for the drama to happen, but also they like to hold notes for a long time. Kind of a conflicting ideal there, but also I have to wonder how he'd react. And it's not like he wasn't around during a time where they existed. I believe the first edition of this came out in the 40s. So, musicals were around for a pretty long time. Where is this? Yeah, the first edition came out was written at least in 1947 in Madison, Wisconsin. Cool place. But also, I wonder how he would react to that. While writing this little part of my script, actually, I kind of wondered how Partch would react to rap. It's kind of quintessentially what he's getting at. It's words with proper rhythm, phonics, with a drama, with... I forgot what the third thing was. Intrinsic meaning. I have to wonder if he had been alive today, or, at any time where rap was really a relevant or widely accepted art form. I wonder how he would think about that. But I wouldn't know. I'm not a Partch scholar. Next up on the chopping block is Berlioz, who, honestly, I have a hard time kind of gauging Partch's opinion of, because on one hand, it's like, it seems like he wants to support him, because he really emphasizes Berlioz's free thinking at the time and how he approached opera, but also kind of a tad demeaning or contemptuous of Berlioz at other times. Here, though, I had another question. Kind of Partch's reaction to Charles Ives. There's a specific song out of his 114 songs called Charlie Routledge. And I have to wonder, would that be closer to fitting his idea of the corporeal music? If you haven't heard it, it's an interesting one. I recommend going to listen to that. The rest of the chapter 1 kind of continues in the vein discussing opera. How it's changed over time, and really left me with one key takeaway. My after-chapter note on this one read, I get the sense that abstract is a derogatory word for Partch, and I'll admit some confusion on why that is. Should man not want both the corporeal and the abstract? And maybe it just came off of that way because there was just so much that Partch described as abstract music, and he really only described his own music as examples of the corporeal. At least in this chapter, because he clearly states he just won't describe or discuss recitation to music, and it has been omitted here, although it is certainly corporeal music. So I guess my main question would be then, why spend so much time on what is not corporeal music? Why not talk about other composers and how they approach corporeal music? Like Stravinsky's L'Histoire du Soldat. Recitation to music, a lot of the time. Is that not something in the corporeal vein? And I don't have an answer to that. Chapter 2, American Musical Tendencies. My only actual note on this chapter is on page 50. This is the first time, on page 50, is the first time that Partch does not outright deride the idea of abstract music. Right? This chapter is kind of focused on how America fits into musical traditions, or that's what I wanted to tell you based on the title. But my after chapter note actually reads, honestly did not feel like an exploration of American music all that much. Yes, comments are made on the American preferences, but unlike the previous chapter, he makes no comments on composers who might be striving towards similar ideals in the American landscape. The chapter is, honestly, just a longer discussion on corporeal versus abstract music, and ends out part 1. Part 2, an introduction to intonation. Chapter 3 is definitions. Specifically, as the title of the chapter says, definitions pertaining to intonation. There's a little introductory page where Partch makes this claim, and I'll read this out for you. A writer on theory must make a rough guess as to how much knowledge of the subject is possessed by the majority of those he hopes to interest, and he starts from that guess. If the guess is wrong, if an interesting reader finds that the starting point is beyond his understanding, he only has to skip the definitions, referring to them later as questions arise, which they may elucidate, and perhaps again after finishing the balance of the work. Long story short, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, come back later, and you might. At the time, I kind of agree with this take. It is a fair take. If you're writing a book on music theory, you have to write it for a level. You have to pick a target audience and go, this is what I expect my target audience to know at the start of this book, and here's what I want them to know at the end. If you don't do that, your book is essentially serving who? Who knows? If you make the assumption that it's for a beginner who knows no music theory, obviously you have to explain certain things. However, if you expect to write a book for a doctorate in music theory, again, there are things you can leave out that the beginner would find impenetrable, because you're working off of the basis that they understand what you're not explaining. And now, I don't really agree with that, for one simple reason. Out of the 74 definitions in this chapter, and yes, I counted, and yes, I wrote almost all of them down, which is why I stopped taking notes. None of them really explain what he's talking about. He also uses several terms to describe the same thing, which is like, you're making this music theory. You're developing this system of music and how to define things in it. Why invent multiple terms that mean the exact same thing? Geometric proportion. See harmonic proportion. Why do this? You invented that term. You invented both of those terms. There's only 3 terms between them. They're on the same page. Just don't use one. I don't understand that. Chapter 4, the language of ratios. This ratioed me. It clowned on me. It made my head hurt. I have the note, he's making me do math. This sucks. I also have a note in the book questioning why he says cycles per second, because I'm pretty certain Hertz was adopted for the international use in science prior to the publication of the book, at least the second edition. Maybe he just didn't bother to change that. I don't know. Beats me. Don't care. Just wondered about it. The rest of the chapter is dedicated to the discussion of ratios, as Partch doesn't really use note names, or names for intervals, or names for a lot of things in his system. Just uses ratios. I can't find it, but I did read the book Equal Temperament Has Ruined Harmony. You know, my last book review. Feel free to watch that. Before reading this section, and my notes just kind of read, might have been a good thing I read that before this, because now I understood tiny bits of what he was talking about. Chapter 5 is where we get into the meat of things, and consequently where my headache became a little more permanent. You know how I said last chapter, Partch doesn't really use note names or names for intervals in his system, describing everything as a ratio? Yeah, there's a reason for that. Basic monophonic concepts, chapter 5, introduces us to a single overarching truth of the monophonic concept that Partch is explaining. Music only happens in intervals. Therefore, everything must be described as a ratio because all intervals are ratios. There are no note names because everything is a ratio compared to something else. We also begin to learn the 4 concepts. In order, number 1, the scale of musical intervals begins with absolute consonants, 1 to 1, and gradually progresses into an infinitude of dissonance, the consonants of the intervals decreasing as the odd numbers of their ratios increase. Overnumber tonality, or O-tonality, major, is an immutable factor of ratios, which in turn represents an immutable faculty of the human ear. Undernumber tonality, or U-tonality, minor, is the immutable faculty of ratios, which in turn represents an immutable faculty of the human ear. He actually takes 3.5 pages of discussing point 4 to get to point 4, which is an interesting idea. But in terms of consonants, man's use of musical materials has followed the scale of musical intervals expressed as concept 1. From the earliest time, it has progressed from the unison in the direction of the great infinitude of dissonance. This guy talks a lot. He takes a long time to say things. Relatively speaking, chapter 5 is pretty short. It just explains those 4 concepts I gave to you. So I really only had 2 comments. First being, what I wrote in the book's margins, did this man write with the thesaurus open? And 2, in my notebook, Partch made up a lot of words and terms, and really likes to use them. My final comment after the chapter was, what the fuck, dude? So many words, so little makey sense. And I stand by that. Instruments for demonstration is chapter 6, and essentially talking about ratios and how different instruments can demonstrate them. Talks about a lot of math and strings, which nothing I can go super in-depth to, because math is hard and boring to a lot of people, including me. Part 3, the resources of monophony. Chapter 7, analysis of the 5 limit, is the first chapter of part 3. My notes read, What even happened here? I had to look up now, both during reading this, again while I was writing the script, and I assume again while I'm editing this, what a 5 limit is. I'm not well versed in this tuning theory, right? This is not something I understand a lot of. I enjoy the idea, and I'm trying to learn about it, but it just made large portions of this book very hard to comprehend. Because, right, in his whole chapter of definitions, Partch really only talks about his new definitions, his concepts that he created or is describing differently in his theory. There are a few non-unique terms, but those are pretty rudimentary topics, like sense, but not terms that are fundamental to a lot of these discussions. Like, this chapter. This chapter bases around the discussion of 5-limit tuning. He does not explain what 5-limit tuning is, right? He'll describe what scents are, in the concept of tuning, but he won't describe the 5-limit, which sense is a much more beginner term than the 5-limit. Let me tell you that. He basically just says it exists, and there are 7 5-limit intervals in 12-tone equal temperament. And if you're wondering, this is the definition of 5-limit tuning. I'll leave that there for a second. The only other fun thing that happened in this chapter was where I actually wrote in the book, I have never felt so stupid while reading a book before. Application of the 11 limit, chapter 8, a lot of the same issues, but I start to have a few other small nitpicks, right? Number one is kind of how Partch presents information. There's a quote in here where he kind of says, it's not necessary to cite the experiments of scientists to corroborate this assertion, since 17 years of playing music in a 43-tone scale have repeatedly corroborated its perceptibility. Which, I don't agree with that statement, right? He does cite experiments, but it's also like, why say you don't need to cite experiments and then cite experiments, right? In fact, why say you don't need to cite them at all? Because believing you based on personal experience is not something I'm really a fan of doing. Because a lot of people who have personal experience are absolute and total idiots. They like to talk about things that they don't really understand. And they like to just blatantly state mistruths and things that are not, in fact, interesting or correct in any terminology and might be moderately problematic in a lot of situations. Okay? I'm not saying any names in particular. I'm not, mentioning any authors who I think do a horrible job of this and have really cemented my opinion that sources need to be properly cited for things. And you shouldn't cite a source unless you actually read it and understood it. Okay? Not pointing at anyone specifically here, but I did review this book recently. I don't know if you've seen that review. But yes, if you haven't seen this review, I highly recommend it. I think it's a good hour and a half of me talking about this book, which I will say, in a fair and honest opinion, Partch does a much better job than that. But I'm testy about the idea that you don't need to cite other sources just because you personally have spent 17 years doing something. Right? I've heard someone else cite personal experience before, and their personal experience directly goes against a lot of things. I'm going to put that book away because it upsets me. This is also the first chapter where he describes the monophonic scale, which has 43 tones in it. I can actually play it for you here, real quick. This is thanks to some neat computer stuff I do not understand. Thank you. There's also this neat diagram which compares the steps to the steps of 12-tone equal temperament. That was kind of cool. He ends this chapter by just absolutely ragging on 12-tone equal temperament. Like, no holds barred, very upsetting statements. I literally wrote, chip on his shoulder, ? The next few chapters kind of got grouped together in my notes because there were essentially no notes on the next few chapters. This isn't for the usual reasons I don't take notes, which is that I don't need to. But I just straight up could not understand what was going on and had no clue what to take notes on. Chapter 9 is called, and I quote, The One-Footed Bride. I think it's about consonants. Not entirely certain, I will not lie to you. I wrote on page 154, several pages in, brain hurty. There's a lot of science and math going on here, and I'm really bad at numbers, okay? Chapter 10 is the 28 tonalities, and my note on this page just reads, oh god, I missed 12 tone equal temperament. Most of the chapter is based around this concept of a tonality diamond, which originally created by Max Friedrich Meyer, but now is mostly associated with Harry Partch. A tonality diamond, according to Wikipedia, is a two-dimensional representation of ratios in which one dimension is the overtonality and one the undertonality, also known as the O-tonality and U-tonality. I do not know how to explain more of this chapter in a way that can do it justice. By this point, if you think this is interesting, please just go buy the book. Please, keep watching. I'd love to give you my opinion. But if this is something you're understanding by my description, you might have a better time understanding it than I did. The question of resolution, chapter 11, actually discusses two things. Resolution, as the name suggests, but also modulation. And kind of transposition. Partch discusses how different resolution and modulation have to be in order to work, and kind of be considered in the monophonic concept, rather than how they work in equal temperament. Due to the fact that, the monophonic scale that Partch has created is not, in fact, an equal temperament scale. The steps of the scale are uneven in size. The idea of modulation, as we understand it, this kind of changing of keys, has to be considered differently, especially in how transposition works then, as well. Due to, the concept of keys functioning fundamentally differently. I understood this chapter a lot better than the previous two, but it's one that can be kind of hard to explain without a deep understanding of the monophonic concept, and it can be hard to just agree with Partch, because, he developed a lot of this theory, and it's his own system of music, and he states, it is heavily influenced by his own experiences. Without listening and being able to hear this theory in action, as I kind of have been with Western music and Western theory, it's hard to make sense of. The next two chapters are grouped together as well, based on what they discuss, and in combination with the next chapter, there are in fact a few pages of pictures of the instruments that Partch has built. And that would be because chapter 12 discusses those instruments. Chapter 12, String and Voice Instruments and Their Notations, discusses string and voice instruments and their notations. Chapter 12 was actually one of the main reasons I wanted to read this book. I found this website a long time back that documents Partch's different instruments and catalogs of them. And I wanted to be able to, pick up the book and read, see his descriptions and how he notates and how he uses the instruments he designed to work in his system of music. That was what I found most fascinating about all of this, particularly in the notation, because I'm a bit of a notation nerd. Along with that is chapter 13, percussion instruments and their notation. Same concept, And as he goes on to describe the 53 different instruments he had built or had a hand in designing over his career, he very fragmentedly discusses his notation systems, because it's kind of a hodgepodge. He doesn't rely on a single system. This is going how he presents it in the book, because I don't really have access to any of his scores, which is a little frustrating to me, but, hard to get a hold of those kind of things. Overall, I could spend several hours going over these chapters individually, and I might at some point talk about the notation systems, because they were interesting, to say the least. But we're also getting close to the end of the book that I'm here to discuss, and we're kind of far in, so let's just keep tracking. Chapter 14 is the last part in chapter 3, and is dedicated to discussing 6 of Partch's major works: U.S. Highball, the Plectra and Percussion Dances, Oedipus, The Bewitched, Revelation in the Courthouse Park, and Delusion of the Fury. He technically also discusses And on the Seventh Day Petals Fell in Petaluma, but mostly as it pertains for this preparatory study for Delusion of the Furies. I'll quote his last paragraph in the chapter. A synopsis cannot in any way proxy for an actual production. Only theater will bring the concept to life. And I must emphasize the fact that these verbal descriptions are intended merely as a small imitation of the art that I envision. So yeah, it's interesting descriptions, but also no replication or replacement for witnessing one of these people put on. Which, there are a few YouTube videos out there of at least small sections. I know Castor and Pollux I watched some of, which is from the plectrum and percussion dances. Interesting watch. Check it out. And then begins part 4. Chapters 15 through 18 are all on the history of intonation. This could have been its own book. I have quite literally read a shorter book, and mentioned it already, on this entire subject. Yes, I have quite literally read a shorter book on this entire subject. And one that was a lot nicer to 12-tone equal temperament, okay? This, while not complimentary, nowhere near as verbally, debasing. I will be honest with you, I cannot cover all of this part. One, because I value what little sanity I have been left with after reading this whole book, and two, because I just do not know what to cover. This was an upsettingly dense section, and by the time I got to this part of the book, I was running out of energy, and I needed to make it through. That was the whole thing I was focused on. If you're really deep in the interest in tuning and kind of how it's developed over time, excellent, fascinating read. I guarantee it. But props to you, I could not do it. When I got here, I was just like, save me. And apart from the appendices and the other stuff, that's the whole book. And now I get to give you my opinion. I will be honest with you, the pain that this book has caused me was almost physical at times. This is an incredibly dense theoretical work, and one that you need time to properly digest. Even now, I'm conflicted on it. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not certain that Partch managed to bring me around to his way of thinking. One, because I believe I mentioned that in this review, actually. Being a little antagonistic towards your target audience does not make them inclined to agree with you. There's things that he wanted me to come around on that I don't know if I could. His scale being better than 12-tone equal temperament. His concept of how music is split, concert or corporeal versus abstract. And I think most especially, actually, I think his notation style was a bit of a crime. That one could have used another look at it. Not gonna lie to you. But I think a work like this, or any work that doesn't really deal with the system of music that you've been brought up to understand, can be hard to digest. Any work, for me, that doesn't just kind of build on the concepts of the Western canon, I think it needs to be taken in alongside listening examples, You need to be able to hear and understand when concepts are being put into place and put into practice, and hear how those concepts, based on how you understood them, might have actually come across in a composer's work differently. Concepts or theories that are put forward by composers are particularly reliant on this concept of being able to hear, I think, in my opinion. But it's also easiest to find examples for those when they're well-known composers, right? Partch, you can find his music online, but let's take two other examples real quick. Arnold Schoenberg and Paul Hindemith. Well, essentially both build off of traditional Western canon and music theory, as most people understand it. Their work can be difficult to kind of comprehend on a theoretical level. Just solely theoretical level. I recall my first music theory class in college when we finally got around to discussing 12-tone serialism, as Schoenberg put forward. I personally found it easy enough to understand, but I had plenty of classmates who were like, this is nonsensical. This is ridiculous. Which, I kind of get where they're coming from. That was my first initial reaction to Schoenberg's music, I'm not going to lie to you. And as we moved into listening to the work, they kind of clowned on it. They were like, it's not that great, it sounds bad, it's just random notes in order. And I think, regardless of their personal appreciation for the music, or how they felt about it, it made more sense after listening to it, right? You could tell that there was a desired effect, and Schoenberg explains that in his theory, and then puts it into practice in his music. Likewise, for another class, I performed and analyzed a bit of Hindemith's Bassoon Sonata, for a bit of a mock lecture recital. And to do this, I picked up Hindemith's first book. And I will admit, as I did, I believe, in my review of it, I had a hard time understanding it. It was not something I was particularly primed to get at the time, and it made more sense as I analyzed and performed the music he was discussing and had written based on that. I'm actually looking forward to rereading it, in light of the fact that I recently acquired book 2, and plan to do a review on it at some point. I will admit that this particular video has thrown me off by a number of weeks. But I could slowly pick up the concepts he was describing as they were applied in the bassoon sonata, and that helped me understand the concepts on kind of a deeper level. So I think the biggest issue I had with Genesis of a Music was, in fact, that lack of assisted comprehension. Partch, all the way back in the beginning, if you'll remember, had that line about a writer on theory needs to guess where his target audience is. And I told you at the time when I started that, I kind of agreed with it. And now I kind of evolved into this view where I'm like, yes, but also be willing to explain. Or in this example, in Genesis of a Music 2nd edition, Partch has relied more on definitions than kind of using the examples we've come to expect from music theory work. Right? It's hard to find his examples alongside them being put into practice. And I made the point to mention that at only a few points in this book does any kind of sheet music actually appear. And even then, it's very brief, very small. And it's never really alongside, I think, important theoretical discussions on how he's been using them. Right? Like, he'll explain, oh, this is how intervals work and how I would construct chords. Show us that. Show us the notation for it, so we can get an idea of it. Tell us where we can find that in a piece of yours so we can listen for it. And I actually took the time to listen to a fair bit of Partch's music, nowhere near comprehensively. It was Daphne and the Dunes. There was a small album that had examples of his instruments. Castor and Pollux, as I mentioned earlier. And I believe a small segment of US Highball. But I found it difficult to pull out this theory that Partch was really trying to discuss. Granted, I'm no scholar in the subject, and I imagine with years of study and being immersed in the music, it would be a lot easier. However, is that the person he wrote this book for? Someone who studied his music and made his music alone? I don't think so. I think I was kind of in place to be his target audience. Someone who understood Western music theory and understood that there are other options to explore and discuss. But I don't think Partch wrote it successfully if I was his target audience. Right? I think he missed several areas where he could have expanded more typically on the basics. If you're willing to explain what a cent is in the concept of tuning, the distance, arbitrary distance between an octave, but you're not willing to explain what 5, 7, 11 limit tuning is, or other more, I want to say, almost advanced intermediate level tuning concepts, I think you kind of misjudged where your target audience was, Partch. And being a little self-biased here, I think that I was kind of in a good place for that, and you missed me. But overall, I believe The Genesis of a Music, 2nd edition, by Harry Partch, was both a thought-provoking and painful work to slog through. And I do call it a slog, because there were points there where I'm like, I'm reading this because I'm writing a review. I'm not reading this because I'm interested. I'm not reading this because I understand it and want to learn more. But I am always intrigued by those who are willing to forge their own path. I'm a huge Charles Ives aficionado. I picked the worst book to I picked a really bad book to actually display that idea. But I am a huge fan of Charles Ives, who people kind of consider this American maverick composer. I would say kind of definitively that Partch was a lot more of a maverick, but I'm always so fascinated by these, people, these individuals who look for their own path in the world of music. Nothing says dedicated to a path more than breaking off any ties with 12-tone equal temperament, literally throwing all of your music into a fire. I think he mentioned that at one point. And then spending the next few decades writing a theory of music, writing a system of music, building tens of instruments for it, setting up these large-scale productions for it. And if nothing else, I deeply respect that Harry Partch was willing to do that. And his willingness to be true to himself is something that I find deeply inspiring. His book, on the other hand, has given me several months' worth of headaches and has almost single-handedly been responsible for delaying several projects on this channel. To sum it up, I will read the one passage from my notes labeled Final Thoughts. Holy shit, my brain hurts. Thanks. I'll see you next time.